All right, this morning we're going to look at some Baptist history, and I alluded to the time period last week. It'd be the similar time period, but we're going to look at the man William Kiffin, spelled Kiffin, just a different name to know, William Kiffin. William Kiffin was born in London in the early 1600s. When he was 9 years old, the plague swept through London, killing both his parents. He should have died. He had sores all over his body, but God miraculously saved him. And he was placed in the custody of a guardian, but then that guardian promptly squandered the boy's inheritance for his own pleasure. At the age of 15, to no one's surprise, he left that home, ran away, and wandered in the streets of London, where he was a miserable young man. And then on a whim, he went into a church service where he heard a sermon on 1 John 1:7, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. And he said this, he said, I had for some time seen the want of Christ and believed that it was by him only I must expect pardon, and had also seen the worth and excellencies that were in him above all other objects, so that I now felt my soul to rest upon and to trust in him. So when he was 18 years old, he asked the Lord to save him. After some real study for about a year or so, he decided that he would join the Baptist church. He was baptized and joined the Baptist church. God called him to preach very soon thereafter, and he was trained by his pastor to preach, and soon he was preaching everywhere as much as he could. This immediately got him in trouble with the authorities. And we're in 1600s in England, and there's no religious freedom in England at this time. And so he was not a Church of England preacher. He was a Baptist, and of course that got him in a lot of trouble. He was immediately thrown in jail when they caught him preaching. But even in jail, he preached to those who would gather to hear the scriptures. When he was 21, the church he belonged to formed another church in Devonshire Square, and Kiffin was called to be their pastor. He remained as pastor of that church for 61 years. And just after the church was organized, as soon as they found out who the new pastor was, he was arrested again and sent to prison. In 1643, he left, or actually kind of escaped to Holland because of the persecution. It was there that to make a living, he entered the wool trade and made a considerable amount of money while he was there and before he returned to England. When he returned to England, a couple of years later, he was a moderately wealthy man at that point. Just the Lord had changed his circumstances dramatically. And he used that money to kind of, on a whim, enter the shipping business and continued to preach the gospel as pastor of the church in Devonshire. He soon became, through this merchant business, one of the wealthiest men the wealthiest merchants of his day. And but he realized very seriously that God had given him his wealth, and he used it over and over again to help fellow Baptist brethren that were in prison and persecuted. So we talked about this man last week, but the king at this point is Charles II, and he would be the monarch through much of Kiffin's life. And Charles II, it seemed, was always broke. He was always short of cash, and it was estimated that he was in debt $250 million or very early in his reign. And in the providence of God, and this is really an interesting story about Kiffin and the king had taken a liking to Kiffin even though he was a Baptist. He's a dissenter. He's not part of the Church of England, and therefore he is always at odds with the law. But the king took a liking to him for some reason. And it's amazing, really, that the king would not only like him, but even tolerate him in light of what was going on. But it might have been because of this one event in his life, and this is an interesting story. At one point, the king, probably knowing who all the wealthy people were in the kingdom, because he's always broke, so he's always looking for a way to get a handout, he asked Kiffin, he called him in, and he said he asked him to loan him 40,000 pounds. Now, couple things. 40,000 pounds is almost $400,000 in today's money, okay? And Kiffin had to think very quickly. You did not tell the king no if you valued life, but he knew that if he loaned the king the money, he'd never see the money again, of course, because it was the king said it was a loan, but it wasn't a loan. And so he had to think quickly, and he replied that he would not lend the money to the king, but would His Majesty accept a free gift of 10,000 pounds. The king was only too glad to receive it, and I think he breathed a sigh of relief, but for years, Kiffin joked with his friends that his quick thinking had saved him his neck and 30,000 pounds. And God would use this respect that the king had for him in a wonderful way. Not long after this, the king issued a declaration of reestablishing the Anglican Common Book of Prayer. Now, the Common Book of Prayer, to simplify it, is a place that the Anglican Church there are prayers in the book, but much of the Common Book of Prayer at that time was a place where the Anglican Church could put all the things they couldn't find in the Bible. They could put them in the Common Book of Prayer and force the clergy and the population to go by the Book of Prayer. And one of those things was infant baptism. So infant baptism is not found in the Bible, and so they put it in the Book of Prayer. And so this was, again, the Church of England's way to control the lives of the population and the clergy. For example, if you preached against infant baptism because it was in the Common Book of Prayer, you would be imprisoned. And over 2,000 pastors were thrown out of their pulpits during this time because of the coercion and the Common Book of Prayer. In 1664, a group of Baptists had been meeting illegally, and they were arrested and imprisoned by the religious court. 3 months after their arrest, the court told them they were required to conform to the Church of England or leave the country. If they refused to do either, they would be sentenced to death. And to show their leniency, the court gave them until the afternoon to decide. So these 12 men and women, this group was led by their pastor. These were just normal citizens, and they decided, following the Scripture, that they would obey God rather than men when it came to the worship of God. There were just normal people. They said there was a candle maker and a farmer and a shoemaker. There was a widow with 6 children. There was an elderly woman also. And refusing to conform, they were sentenced to death, and they were sent back to the prison to await their executions. With no time to spare, the farmer's son, his name was Thomas Monk, he mounted his horse and he sped away to London, a couple of hours' ride. There he found William Kiffin, the man we're studying. He gave him the details of what was going on. Kiffin quickly hurried to the palace and to talk to the Lord Chancellor and requested the case be presented to Charles II. The king, hearing it was Kiffin who was requesting the meeting, stopped what he was doing and turned and heard the story. Now, the king, for reasons only known to God, promised a pardon and ordered the Lord Chancellor to stop the executions. He granted immediate pardon because of the urgency of the situation. The pardon was given to the farmer's son, Thomas Monk, who sped back to Aylesbury to deliver the pardon before it was too late. He did make it on time, and needless to say, those near martyrs were thrilled to see, God's gracious intervention at that point. And so, how wonderful is it to see God's providence in this story? The king takes a liking to this merchant, pastor, Baptist, who gave him a gift of 10,000 pounds, and God uses that respect to then save the lives of these Baptist people. Kiffin is a wonderful example of a man that's very faithful to his ministry, his local church, in a very, very difficult time in Baptist history for Baptists. Somehow, through God's providence, his standing in society was well known, his integrity of character. It gave him influence, and he often exerted it for the protection and the relief of his fellow Baptist sufferers. It is much in his favor also, and historians talk about this when you study the life of William Kiffin, that in those very stormy times, he stood aloof from all political fights. He focused all his efforts on the church he pastored. He tried very hard to be an exemplary citizen of he lived through two kings and Oliver Cromwell, the Protectorate, and each time he honored the king and tried to live an exemplary life. His policy was, historians said, that, and he advised his brethren, he advised his church members to yield obedience to the existing government in all things civil, whatever might be the form of government. He said, because of this, and he did say, but because of this, the King of England himself took notice and held him in high esteem. Interesting comment here about his times and what he stood for. Perhaps mostly remembered for his preaching and his scholarly works, something I haven't gone into, but he's considered one of the great Baptist scholars of the 17th century. He carefully lived out his Baptist convictions, and he lived until the age of 86, where he is buried in Bunhill Fields there with the other great dissenters of his day, Daniel Defoe and John Bunyan. And so this morning I want to thank the Lord for this man, his sterling character. And it's exciting actually to read history when you read it, with the idea of God's providence in mind. It really is amazing to see God working among men and women and situations. And this is a story that points us out this morning.